Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to look at this box here. It's called the Pawky Box. Now this is a cheap Chinese gaming box that's basically an Android TV box that also runs emulation. Now you may have seen some of my previous videos about the Super Console X devices, and this box is almost exactly like those, but there are a few subtle differences. Right now the Pawky Box is selling for about $60 after some discounts, but the price can go up to $90 depending on the size of SD card that you purchase. And devices like this and the Super Console X are very popular because they're preloaded with all the games. Essentially, the goal with these boxes is to be able to just plug them directly into your TV and start playing immediately. No need to download games or tweak the settings or anything else like that. And this box is a direct competitor with Super Console X. It's not only a few dollars cheaper, but the company themselves seem to be going after Super Console X. Their official YouTube channel literally has a video that says Pawky Box is way cooler than the Super Console X Pro. So let's take a few minutes and find out whether the Pawky Box is indeed cooler than the Super Console X Pro. Alright, we'll start with a quick unboxing here. I will say that the box is significantly smaller than the regular Super Console X Pro box. On top of that, they've added this little DIY projection box too. I would definitely say this is a thoughtful box and more family oriented. Let's take a look inside. So below the console itself, you can see it comes with two controllers. Here's the AC adapter, it looks exactly like the Super Console X one. Same thing with this remote control, which you can use on the Android side. So these are the controllers here. I'll spend a minute with these later on in the video. And these are the materials for that DIY projection box. I personally didn't set it up, I wanted to focus on the gaming, but it's there if your kids want to play around with it. As far as I/O, you have an SD card slot, two USB ports, and then on the back you have your power port with a button, which is handy, HDMI out, an Ethernet port, and then an AV out as well. Now the company sent me this one to review, and it looks like they sent me the 256GB model, so this is the $90 version. So doing a direct physical comparison between the Super Console X Pro and the Pawky Box, you can see that they're actually exactly the same. In reality, they've taken the exact same board, and for some reason they flipped it around from the Super Console X Pro, so everything's upside down. And unfortunately, the case itself in the Pawky Box is not lined up perfectly. I actually had to use a screwdriver to pry up this HDMI port so that I could get the HDMI cable to fit. And here we are, if I flip them around, you can see that they're exactly the same. In terms of looks, I've always thought that the Super Console X is really kind of cheap looking, but I do think it has some good thermals on the bottom, especially compared to the Pawky Box. Honestly, if it wasn't for just the words Pawky Box on the front, which I think are a little bit tacky, I would say this box looks a lot better than the Super Console X Pro. I like that it's all of a uniform shape, and I really do like the two different colors here. And there are various colors available to purchase if you want to try a different color too. So I think all things considered, physically I like the Pawky Box a lot better than the Super Console X Pro. Now that HDMI port is a little bit troubling, and it may have just been my box, but honestly once you plug the HDMI port in one time, it's not going to be very often that you're going to be unplugging it and replugging it. So all in all, I do really like this Pawky Box physically. Now let's talk about these controllers. It's funny, with these controllers, when you first see them, you're like, oh, they're like an upgrade. And even my kids, when they saw them, they're like, oh, we want to use those ones instead of the Super Console X Pro ones. But then once you put them in your hands, it's actually not so great. The D-pad's a great example here. It really doesn't feel good. Diagonals are basically impossible. And forgive my yellow fingernails here, I was cooking with turmeric earlier in the day. When it comes to the face buttons, they're fine. The analog sticks are pretty good as well. The shoulder buttons leave a lot to be desired. They have a lot of play to them, so they kind of wobble there in place. And overall, when you're actually holding the device, it is pretty comfortable in the hands. It has a simple on and off switch, and it also takes AAA batteries, much like the Super Console X Pro controllers. Like I was saying, this is actually a very ergonomic feeling controller when you first hold it in your hands. And if you're just using the analog sticks and the shoulder buttons, it's fine. But the moment you touch the D-pad, you're like, oh, this is garbage. Now let's look at the Super Console X Pro controller. This is basically just a cheap knockoff of the PS2 controllers. That being said, it's a very familiar shape and size. And yeah, none of the buttons are very good. The D-pad's not great. The face buttons are just kind of cheap feeling, but it's a solid little controller. All the things that bother me about the blue controller don't really resonate here with this one. And I had both my kids test each controller, and they easily decided they like the Super Console X Pro controller better than this Pawky Box one. So something to keep in mind if you're thinking that this might be an upgrade. It may not be. Okay, plugging in the box here and booting it up, you get a nice splash screen, and then it's actually going to load into emulation. Now this is running emulation 3.9, and that's probably the furthest you want to go with emulation because emulation 4.0 requires a lot more RAM, and this device only has 1GB of RAM. As you can see, this 256GB card has 50,000 games on it. First thing I want to do is mess around with the themes and see what other options are available just right out of the box. So you have a couple different themes here. This is the Electful Solo one. I like this one. And even navigating through the games on this one looks pretty good. This is the other theme here. It's called Pixel. This one's okay, but honestly, I kind of like my themes a little bit flashier. So we're going to go into the updates section, look at the themes downloader, and see the other options we have available. Let's download this one. It's called Crystal. I like this one a lot. Let's use this as the default for the rest of this video. Now, when you first go into a system page, you're going to see that all the games are actually in this kind of grid layout. You can change this easily by going into the theme configuration and then changing the game list view style. This one's called the detailed view. I prefer this one. And yeah, it's a really simple interface. You just kind of navigate through, pick your system, then pick your game. But one thing you may notice with the game descriptions is that they're written in Brazilian Portuguese. And that seems like a kind of odd mix from a device coming from China, but this is actually a pretty common thing with these preloaded devices. And that's because they're taking the images from a community page called Galisteo. And this team, which is based in Brazil, creates these preloaded images. And what these Chinese companies do is they flash these images onto their own SD cards, and then make some tweaks to settings, change the name to Kinhank or other names, and then they deliver it that way. But unfortunately, simple things like making sure that the translations are in English don't really happen. You might get lucky and some of the descriptions might be in English, but for the most part, they're all going to be in a foreign language. So I also want to show you what the experience is like on a typical boot up of when you're going to start playing a game. So say the device is plugged in, your TV's hooked up, and then you power it on. It's going to load you through the emulate pages here, and there's a couple different splash pages you have to go through. And you're also going to want to disable the video that starts up every time, and that's a very simple thing you can change in the emulate settings. But as you can see here, if you're someone who's used to playing like an Xbox or a PS4 which has a sleep mode, this is not a very quick process. Getting to the main interface takes almost 45 seconds, and from there you got to pick your game and then load that as well. So say I just go into the first system available, which is Super Nintendo, and I pick the second game there, and I start loading that one up. You can see it's almost exactly 1 minute before the game actually starts. Now, I'm not really complaining about 1 minute from boot up to playing, but it is something that I definitely felt lagged a little bit, and you might too. Okay, let's start showing off some gameplay. Let's start with Famicom Disk System just to be crazy here, and we're going to do Doki Doki Panic. Now, in addition to being a very familiar game, you might also notice that it's a little bit soft looking. So let's make some tweaks to the settings in the main menu. Like I mentioned before, you can turn off that boot video. Let's do that real quick so you can see what that looks like. We're going to go into emulate settings here, and then always show boot video, turn that one off. Now we'll go into game settings, and then under smooth games, let's turn that one off too. That's going to remove bilinear filtering. And here we go, now you can see that the game is much sharper looking. I really like the bloxy pixelated look when I'm playing 8-bit and 16-bit games. So for that reason, I like to turn the smooth games off. But man, I just can't shake the feeling that this is a very familiar looking game. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, when booting up a Game Boy game, you're going to see that it's not in a green color, it's kind of a grayscale color. So jump into the RetroArch Quick menu by pressing Select and X. Within here, you can go into Options, and then turn on Game Boy Colorization. Set it to Internal. On top of that, I would recommend turning on interframe blending for LCD ghosting accurate. That's going to give you the closest approximation to the original Game Boy screen. And here it is here. It's a little bit greener of a tint than the original DMG Game Boy, but I still think it looks pretty nice. Now, in addition to about 500 Game Boy games, there's about 550 Game Boy Color games on here. And you have all sorts of selections, everything from Zelda even to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And you can answer challenging questions like, what Mexican holiday takes place on May 5th? Moving along, here's Game Boy Advance. One thing you may notice is every system has these same emulate bezels on the sides. And for the most part, that's going to be great for 4x3 systems. But it doesn't look right with something like Game Boy Advance, which is a 3x2 aspect ratio system. So let's go into the RetroArch Quick menu, and here in the on-screen display section, you can turn off the bezels, but even then it's still showing a 4x3 image. So let's go into the video settings, then scaling, and you can see it has a custom aspect ratio. And that probably looks great for most games, but let's change this one to 3x2 for Game Boy Advance. Now when we start it up, we can see that it's a little bit wider of an image, and this is what it's supposed to look like. So when you're playing games like Babar to the Rescue, it's going to have the proper aspect ratio. For the most part, Game Boy Advance games play just fine on this system. Moving on to other handheld systems, Game Gear plays just fine, no surprises there. And Nintendo DS is really the only handheld system that has issues. If we go into the settings here and we make sure that the high resolution 3D is on, you'll see that by default it has a frame skip of 4 on there. So let's turn that down to frame skip of 1, and you can see here it's only running at about 90% speed. The audio is laggy as well as the gameplay itself. So unfortunately, if you want to have a nice DS display as well as running at full speed, you have to do a frame skip of 4. And for certain games, especially Mario Kart, it's going to look a little bit jittery. Now on the flip side, if you're going to be playing something that's not so speedy, for example Pokemon, it should be relatively okay. Okay, let's move on to console systems now. Let's start off with random games here. This one here looks pretty good. I'll try my best to feature it in future videos. Overall, you're going to have zero problems with any Nintendo games, they all run just great. And with a little bit of tweaking, you can get every Super Nintendo game to work just fine. Things like Donkey Kong Country or Super Mario World, they're going to work just fine right out of the box. But you will have issues with some of the more intense games, the Super FX ones like Star Fox, things like that. As you can see here, just running the default emulator, it's going at about 57-56 frames per second. Not only that, you can see that the game is playing in Brazilian Portuguese. Now this is a pretty simple fix, you just go and hit the select button in the menu, and then select advanced game options. From there you can change the emulator. I would recommend the SNES 9X 2010 core. And sure enough, this one plays at a solid 60 frames per second. So it's just a one-time fix that you have to do for certain games, after that they're going to play fine. Same thing's going to happen with Yoshi's Island. As you can see here, it dips down to something like 58, sometimes 57 frames per second. Not the end of the world, but it will give you some audio stuttering. If you change that over to the SNES 9X 2010 core, you're going to get a solid 60 frames per second. So just do that. Now some of the systems I thought were going to play just fine actually had some problems with the Pawky Box. A good example is Virtual Boy. This one actually had some slowdown in a lot of games. But some of the other systems, like Intellivision, plays just fine. By the way, today is when I realized I have no idea how to play Burger Time. For those of you who play Amiga, I tried several different games and they all seem to play just fine. Okay, moving on to Sega systems now. As expected, Master System has no problems at all. And same thing with Sega Genesis. And one of the kind of cool things about having a big library like this on this Pawky Box is that I can test out games that really I've never even played before. And I think this is one of the things that might attract you to this device in the first place. If you're like me and you didn't have access to every single game when you were a child, this is kind of a cool experience to be able to just jump into games that you've never even heard of and just try them out. Because they're already preloaded, and what's the harm of just seeing what's available? Okay, there's also a ports section on this device, so let's try out some of the ports that are preloaded. And as you can see here, they didn't actually load the data files, so games like Diablo aren't going to play, and even Doom is just the shareware version. So you're going to have to add your own files to this, which kind of takes away from the whole plug and play aspect of this box. If you have to add your own files, then what's the point of having a plug and play device? There are a few open board games on here, so if you're into that, there are a couple that you can choose from. But now let's talk about arcade systems. When I first started up MAME, I picked Captain America and the Avengers, and as you can see here, it was running at under 50 frames per second. It should definitely not do that on a chipset as powerful as this. So I went in and I looked at the per system advanced configuration under the game setting menu, and under the MAME section, they actually had the Final Burn Neo emulator selected. And obviously that's not the correct one, so I changed it to MAME 2003 Plus. And just like that, every game now plays at full speed. So that's something you're going to have to do, is jump into the settings, and again, you only have to do this one time, and after that all the MAME games will play fine. But I can imagine it would be frustrating if you didn't know to do that the first time around. All of a sudden you pay $60 to $90 for a device, and it can't even play Battletoads or Captain America. So just make sure you change out that setting. Now if you go over to the Final Burn Neo section and play some of those games, I found that all the Neo Geo games play at full speed, no problems there. And for the most part, all of the fighting games and beat-em-ups and stuff that are in that folder play really well. But one of the games that didn't play well is Street Fighter 3. And this is one of the harder games to play on this system, so it makes sense. As you can see here, I'm getting about 52-53 frames per second. Now for those games in particular, if you change the emulator to Final Burn Alpha 2012 instead, you're going to get 60 frames per second. So again, just a matter of tweaking those little things. Okay, moving over to PS1, in the RetroArch quick menu, you can turn on the enhanced resolution as well as the speed hack for that. and for the most part you're still going to get 60 frames per second on all the PS1 games. So it's kind of nice, you have an enhanced resolution on these games that honestly look a lot better than they did back in the day. So if you're a big fan of PS1, this is going to be a really great box because there's a ton of games on here, and you can always load a few of your own as well. And honestly, this is about the extent of where this chipset really performs. Let me show you what I mean. Let's start with Nintendo 64. Now by default, if we play a mid-range game like F-Zero X, it's going to run at mostly full speed. But as you can see, the resolution is low, and that's because it's running at a 320 by 240 resolution. So if we go into the quick options here, we change the 4x3 resolution to 640 by 480, and then we reset the game, we're now going to have a higher resolution. But that actually comes at a significant gameplay cost. As you can see here, it's only running at about 42, 43 frames per second. To me, this is unplayable. And so you're kind of in a crossroads here. Do you pick the low resolution, or do you pick the good performance? So let's try some of the other emulator options for Nintendo 64 and see if it's any better. Here's the parallel core, and as you can see, with the low resolution, it's also running at 60 frames per second. But if we bump that up to 640 by 480, you're also going to get about 43, 44 frames per second. So it's really a trade-off here. And 320 by 240 doesn't look good on a lot of big TVs. So that's something to bear in mind if you like to have nice graphics when you're playing your games. Now you have one other core here you can select, and that's the Gloopin 64 core. But as you can see here, even at the low resolution, it's not running at full speed. And on top of that, it actually doesn't register the analog stick at all. So that one's probably not worth messing with. And of course, if you try to play some of the harder to play games like Mario Tennis, it's going to be even worse, about 20 frames per second. So at the end of the day, the only Nintendo 64 games that you can play at 640 by 480 and still have a good gameplay experience are going to be the ones that are really easy to emulate. Things like Mario Kart 64, Super Mario 64, and you might be able to get away with most of the Zelda games too. Alright, let's talk about Sega systems for a bit. We'll start with the Naomi arcade system. This one plays relatively well, the frames per second are all over the place, but the gameplay itself is relatively smooth. Now, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is actually one of the easier games to emulate, so let's try something else. So here we are with GigaWing 2, another Naomi arcade game, and this one has a lot of things going on the screen, and as you can see, it's getting a lot of slowdown too. So I wouldn't expect perfect gameplay out of Sega Naomi games at all. Moving over to Dreamcast, you can see that a lot of these games have issues too. So Crazy Taxi 2, which is like your middle of the road game here, had a good amount of slowdown and a lot of audio stuttering. And then games like Dead or Alive 2 are so slow that I wouldn't even consider them to be playable at all. And games like Soul Calibur play relatively smoothly, but there are a good amount of graphical glitches, and you can definitely tell when there's lags in the performance and sound. And unfortunately, same goes with Sonic Adventure 2. In general, I would say that almost every Dreamcast game had performance issues. Okay, let's look at one more high-performing system, the Sony PSP. What you'll actually notice in the game library is that there's not a lot of actual PSP games on here. There's a lot of PS Mini games, which are a lot like cell phone games, honestly, and maybe 5 or so actual PSP games. Now, the PSP games they have on here are the ones that are going to play really well on this system. So they kind of cherry-picked all these to make sure you feel like you have a nice PSP experience. But the truth is, unless you really like to play Loco Roco or Castlevania Dracula Chronicles, you're going to be disappointed with what you can play on PSP here. Now if you turn off this system, take out the SD card and then boot it back up, you actually can get into an Android interface. And there are some things you can do in here. You can play Netflix and YouTube, and even install some Android games. And I go into depth with that with my Super Console X Pro review, so if you want to see that, I would check out that video. But long story short is most games aren't going to play very well because of the 1GB of RAM, but you could do things like game streaming from your PC on this. At the end of the day, I would recommend staying on the Emulex side of this device, and on top of that, really focusing on PS1 and below gameplay. I think you'll be disappointed with things like Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and PSP, but with a tiny bit of tweaking, all the other systems are going to play just fine. So yeah, wrapping things up here, do I like the Pawky Box? Yeah, honestly, I think it looks really nice, and for what it does, which is a cheap Android box, it works fairly well. At $60, the fact that it comes preloaded with a bunch of games is a pretty cool idea. That being said, the controllers that come with the device are borderline unplayable, so I definitely recommend getting your own game controller if you're going to get serious about your gameplay. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. And we will see you next time. Happy gaming.